Deputy Speaker, I rise to speak in response to the statement by the Minister for Veterans Affairs delivered to the House on Wednesday, 22 March 2017. As the Minister referred to in his statement, the Korean War is often referred to as the Forgotten War. I had cause to reflect upon the speech delivered by the Minister. The Minister very carefully explained the significance of the Korean War and outlined Australian action in the Korean theatre. It was nevertheless very difficult to imagine the times when the Cold War was in its infancy, when due to an accident of history the United Nations took up arms in a conflict with proxies for the superpowers and a nascent superpower, a conflict which might have been escalated to nuclear conflict at any time. In my legal practice many years ago, I undertook a quite substantial practice in the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, addressing DVA claims which were then appeals from the Veterans Review Board. That was in the 1990s. I was still dealing with World War II veterans, Korean War veterans, and of course veterans from the Vietnam War. It always seemed to me that the veterans of World War II easily fell into a particular class, that is with respect to the type of claim and the type of person I was advocating for. Similarly, there were a lot of claims arising out of Vietnam which had similar characteristics. Korean veterans not only fell between the two in a chronological sense, but also with respect to their profile. There was something about the Korean veterans which spoke of a different experience, something which bound them even more together, tightly together, than the World War II veterans, many of whom had fought in completely different theatres in Europe, North Africa, New Guinea, or as prisoners of war, which carried with it another level of complexity. There also seemed to be a historical aspect of the Korean War bracketing the end of the 1940s and the early part of the 1950s. The popular culture that we see that infected Australia from, in particular, the United States, had not entered into public consciousness until the mid to late 1950s. Even Menzies had yet to consolidate and impose his authority on the Australian electorate at this time. There were big issues yet to be resolved between Labor and Capital, big issues which were elevated by the tensions of the Cold War. As the Minister notes in his statement, it is more than 60 years since the last of the conflict had ceased. Nevertheless, we're constantly reminded that the conflict has not been formally resolved, in that no treaty has been negotiated to put an end to the formal conflict. I wonder, therefore, whether the experience of our troops was similar to that of the Vietnam veterans, who had a delayed welcome home because of the public's view as to the merits of the Vietnam War. Whilst it's useful to consider from the perspective more than 60 years after the conclusion of hostilities what a totally different world we now live in, we must never forget, when we send our Defence Forces into harm's way, what it is to serve in the Australian Defence Force. There have been conflicts and peacekeeping missions since Vietnam, and in all cases, the Australian Defence Force has served with distinction. None of these missions, none of these conflicts are entered into lightly. I can readily imagine that the decision of a government to send our armed forces into danger must require careful consideration and, most importantly, accurate information. My involvement with the veterans community arose primarily through the representation of veterans and their families in determining their entitlement to pension and/or compensation. Notwithstanding that the veterans' entitlement legislation is beneficial legislation, there are often lengthy delays in assessing and determining a veteran's entitlement to a pension or a benefit. There are very few remaining Second World War veterans, slightly more Korean War veterans, and larger populations of veterans of subsequent emergencies and warlike operations. It pains me, and it should pain all of us, that particular veterans are denied entitlements because they've failed to demonstrate that their service, and in particular their operational service or none of the other service preconditions for eligibility, are satisfied. It should be time for the government to accept the claims of veterans, irrespective of whether they meet the narrow requirements set out by the bureaucratic system. It is without doubt that the men and women of our Defence Force have devoted their lives, their very lives, to the service of this country, and it should be that on discharge of that duty they should find a grateful Australian government prepared to assist with their rehabilitation if that's required. It is a bitter pill to swallow that whilst the Australian Defence Force has had to lay to rest 41 defence personnel on active service between 2000 and 2014, that the veteran community experiences 292 deaths by suicide up to now. It is time that we, all of us, work together with our veterans to benefit our veterans. Please.